The water had no business being there, not like this. I'm 58 years old, a retired geologist, and if there's one thing I know, it's how water is supposed to behave on a piece of land, my land. But that morning, my backyard was a stranger to me. A shallow, murky lake stretched from my patio to the back fence, drowning the life I'd spent 3 years cultivating since I hung up my hard hat for good. The air was thick with the smell of wet, angry earth and the beginnings of rot. My prized collection of shade-loving hydrangeas, each one a small victory against the stubborn Georgia clay, were submerged up to their necks. Their broad leaves, usually a deep, healthy green, were slicked with a film of mud. It felt like a personal insult from the sky. The storm last night had been a monster, sure, but this wasn't just flooding. This was a siege. This is the kind of story you hear about, right? The kind that ends up on channels like Karenology, and you think, no way that's real. Well, let me tell you, it gets real fast. That's when I saw them. 2 figures in high-visibility yellow vests standing just inside my property line. They hadn't made a sound. One was tall and thin as a rake, the other built like a refrigerator. The vests had the words Homeowners Association Compliance printed on the back. They weren't looking at the water. They were looking at the little solar-powered garden lights I'd staked along the now invisible flagstone path. I pulled on my boots and stepped out into the chill, damp air. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice tight. It wasn't really a question. The tall one didn't even look at me. He just pointed a clipboard at my lights. "Removing unapproved items," he said, his voice as flat and gray as the sky. And without another word, he and his partner started yanking them out of the mud, one by one. The cheap plastic stakes snapped with a sickening crunch. They tossed them into a pile like weeds. "Hey, hold on a second." I sloshed towards them, the cold water seeping over the tops of my boots. "Those have been there for 2 years. What's the problem?" The refrigerator-shaped one paused, one of my lights dangling from his thick fist. He looked at his partner, who just gave a slight shake of his head. "Just following procedure, sir." Procedure. That word makes my teeth ache. It's a word people use when they've stopped thinking. In my old job, procedure was about safety, about keeping people alive. Here, it was a weapon. As they continued their little campaign of destruction, my eyes caught a glint of steel, half buried in the mud near a drowning azalea. My old T-handle soil sampler, a 20-year veteran of a tool that had taken core samples from building sites all over the country. It was a part of me, a symbol of a life where I solved problems, not had them created for me by men in yellow vests. Now, it was sinking into a bog that shouldn't exist. I felt that slow burn of injustice starting in my gut. Have you ever felt that? That completely powerless feeling when someone with a little bit of authority decides to ruin your day just because they can? If you have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Go ahead and hit that like button. Let me know I'm not alone in this. I planted myself in front of the tall one. "Stop, right now. You are on my property, destroying my things. You don't have the right." He finally looked at me, and there was nothing there, just a pair of eyes like dull gray stones. He held out a folded piece of paper from his clipboard. "Your notice, sir." I snatched it from his hand. His fingers were cold and clammy. They finished their work, leaving a sad little pile of broken plastic and solar cells at the edge of my ruined yard. They turned and walked away, their boots making sucking sounds in the mud. They didn't look back. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the morning broken only by the drip of water from the eaves of my house. The soggy piece of paper in my hand felt heavier than it should. I thought it was a fine, maybe a $50 citation for unapproved landscape lighting. Annoying, but manageable. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. I was wrong, it wasn't a fine. Back inside, I peeled off my wet socks and sat at the kitchen table, the smell of mud and defeat clinging to me. With trembling fingers, I carefully unfolded the damp paper. The text was dense, full of legal jargon designed to intimidate. Violation of Bylaw. 17.4. Unauthorized alteration of grade and soil integrity. And then I got to the part that wasn't a fine. It was an order for mandatory geotechnical remediation. My eyes scanned down to the bottom line, past the jargon and the threats. And there it was, a number that made the air leave my lungs. $10,000. $10,000. The number just hung there in the quiet of my kitchen, mocking me. It wasn't a fine, It was an execution. The notice went on to explain, in the most condescending terms imaginable, that this remediation was to be carried out exclusively by a certified community partner named Groundwater Pros. A name so generic it had to be hiding something. A quick search on my laptop confirmed my suspicion. The owner of Groundwater Pros was a one Mr. Henderson, the vice president of our lovely Homeowners Association. Funny how that works, isn't it? One man's problem becomes another man's profit. The notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic entrapment. It stated that failure to comply within 30 days would result in the association placing a lien on my property and carrying out the work anyway, billing me for the privilege. My little solar lights, the supposed cause of all this, weren't even mentioned in the remediation order. They were just the excuse, the key they used to unlock my door and get at my wallet. My first thought was to fight. Call a lawyer, file an injunction, go to war. But I'd been down that road before, in a different life. I ran a small geological consulting firm for a while. A business dispute with a larger competitor bled me dry with legal fees. I won in the end, but winning looked a lot like losing. It cost me my business and a good chunk of my sanity. That's a wound that doesn't ever fully heal. You learn to be wary of fights you can't be certain you'll win quickly. So I decided to play their game, just for a moment. I called the number for Groundwater Pros. A cheerful voice answered, "Your solution to saturation." I asked for a consultation, maybe a second opinion. The voice on the other end laughed, a short, sharp, unpleasant sound. "Mr. Henderson handles all community partner projects personally," she said, "and the association's assessment is the opinion. We just do the work. We can schedule you for next Tuesday." I hung up, the blood pounding in my ears. This wasn't a service. It was a shakedown. The next morning, the social pressure campaign began. I logged into the neighborhood online forum, a place usually reserved for lost cat photos and complaints about garbage collection. Henderson had posted an aerial photo of my property, taken by a drone, I presumed. It was a stark, ugly image of my flooded yard, looking like a festering wound in the otherwise pristine green of the community. The post was titled, "A Serious Matter of Community Well-Being." Henderson wrote with the smooth, practiced concern of a politician. He talked about destabilized soil, unforeseen drainage consequences, and the potential for foundation damage to adjacent properties. He never mentioned me by name, but he didn't have to. We are already taking decisive action to mitigate this issue with a comprehensive, professionally engineered solution, he concluded. The comments rolled in immediately. "Thank you for being so proactive, Mr. Henderson. I was worried about my basement. So glad the board is on top of this." Dozens of them, neighbors I'd shared a beer with at the last block party, were now publicly thanking the man who was trying to rob me. I was being painted as the irresponsible villain who was putting everyone at risk. My phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had replied directly to one of my old posts about gardening. It just said, "Maybe stick to things you know about." I felt the walls closing in. It's an isolating feeling, being on the wrong side of the crowd. It makes you doubt yourself. Was I wrong? Was I the crazy one? I've seen my share of landslips and subsidence. I know what irresponsible development can do. For a fleeting moment, I almost believed their narrative. But then I looked out the window. The water had receded some, leaving behind a thick, slimy coat of silt. And I saw it again. My soil sampler, lying there like an accusation. I knew soil. I knew this land. And this flood wasn't natural. My anger cooled, replaced by a cold, familiar resolve. The resolve of a man who knows he's standing on solid ground, even if it's currently covered in mud. Henderson wanted to make this about public opinion and his hand-picked experts. Fine, but I had an expert of my own, me. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my old friend the soil sampler, and walked out into my ravaged garden. I wasn't just going to get my hands dirty, I was going to dig up the truth. The first plunge of the steel tube into the muck felt different. The resistance was wrong. It was too soft, too yielding. This wasn't just rainwater. Something else was in my soil, and I was going to find out what. The core sampler came up with a wet, sucking sound. I laid the first sample out on a tarp on my garage floor. It looked wrong. The top layer was the rich, dark topsoil I'd trucked in myself, but beneath it was a thick band of greasy gray silt. It was finer than our native Georgia clay, with an almost slimy texture. This wasn't erosion from my yard. This was a deposit. Something had brought this stuff in and dumped it here. I spent the rest of the day taking core samples, a grid pattern across the entire yard, just like I would have for a construction site survey. Each sample told the same story. A layer of foreign sediment, thickest at the back fence and thinning out towards the house. The water that had flooded my yard wasn't just rain. It was a slurry, a muddy soup that had stagnated here and dropped its payload. But from where? My property backed up onto a wooded preserve, a gentle slope that was supposed to be untouched. There were no streams or ponds up there. The water had to have come from somewhere else. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of that $10,000 bill was a physical weight on my chest. But underneath it, there was something else. A flicker of the old professional curiosity. A puzzle to be solved, and I always was a sucker for a good puzzle. The next day, I knew I needed more than just my own analysis. I needed context, history. That's what led me to the town's public library, a quiet, dusty building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. I was looking for old survey maps, plat drawings, anything that could tell me about the land before the houses went up. Behind the main desk sat a man who looked as old as the books around him. He had wispy white hair and glasses thick enough to be bottle ends. His name tag read, Mr. Abernathy. He looked up as I approached, his eyes magnified to a startling size. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "I hope so," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for old development plans for the Oak Haven subdivision, from the 80s if you have them." Abernathy gave me a long, thoughtful look. Oak Haven, built by the Sterling Corporation. They went bust years ago. Most of that stuff is probably lost. He paused, tapping a long, bony finger on the counter. "But I might have something. I'm the unofficial town historian. People give me things." He disappeared into a back room, and I could hear the sound of boxes being shifted and the faint sneeze of disturbed dust. Have you ever met someone like that? A keeper of forgotten things, a gatekeeper to the past. They're treasures, every one of them. While I waited, I thought about how easily we lose our history. We build our houses on top of it and forget what lies just a few feet beneath our manicured lawns. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a rolled-up tube of yellowed architect's drawings. He spread them carefully on a large table, the paper crinkling like autumn leaves. "These are the original utility and drainage plans," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Found them in a dumpster when they tore down the old Sterling office." I leaned over the map, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The drawing showed the familiar layout of our streets and property lines, but underneath, drawn in faded blue ink, was something else. A network of lines labeled subsurface drainage system. A spiderweb of pipes designed to carry excess groundwater away from the properties and down to the county storm sewer. And according to the map, a major artery of that system ran directly along the back of my property. "I'll be damned," I whispered. It was an old system, probably terracotta or concrete pipe. Forgotten, but there. "Funny thing is," Abernathy said, pointing with that same bony finger. "See this note here? System to be maintained by Homeowners Association in perpetuity. That means forever." There it was. Evidence. The Homeowners Association wasn't just responsible for the drainage, they were legally bound to maintain it. Henderson's whole narrative, that this was my fault, that it required a brand new expensive solution, was a lie. He wasn't solving a problem. He was covering one up. His company, Groundwater Pros, was going to get paid $10,000 per house to do work that the association should have been doing all along as part of our dues. And my little solar lights were the perfect pretext to get the ball rolling, to create a problem that only he could fix. I carefully took a photo of the map with my phone, focusing on the drainage lines and the maintenance note. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice thick with gratitude, "you have no idea what you've just done." He just smiled a little. "I'm a librarian's son. It's my job to help people find what they're looking for." I walked out of that library feeling 10 feet tall. I had him. I had the proof. I had the truth. I was going to walk into the next board meeting, slap that map down on the table, and watch Henderson's whole corrupt little empire crumble. It was going to be beautiful. What I didn't know was that Henderson was already 2 steps ahead of me, and the truth I was about to find out isn't always enough. Sometimes it's just the thing your enemy uses to set a better trap. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the Homeowners Association board meeting. It felt like gearing up for a trial. I printed the photo of the old drainage map in large format. I typed up my soil analysis, complete with photos of the core samples, showing the clear demarcation of the silt deposit. I felt the old fire in my belly, the thrill of the hunt. This wasn't just about my $10,000 anymore. This was about the principle. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls and a faint smell of chlorine from the nearby pool. About 30 residents were there, most of them looking either bored or annoyed. Henderson sat at the head of a long table, flanked by the other board members. He looked relaxed, confident, the king in his little castle. He had a smooth, handsome face that the camera would love, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I waited patiently through the droning discussion of parking violations and holiday decoration guidelines. Finally, Henderson moved on to new business. As many of you know, he began, his voice oozing sincerity, we've identified a significant soil stability issue on the north side of our community. Fortunately, your board has acted swiftly. That was my cue. Excuse me, Mr. Henderson, I said, standing up. My voice was louder than I intended, cutting through the quiet room. All heads turned towards me. I believe the board may be operating under a false premise, I continued, walking to the front. I laid the large photo of the drainage map on the table. This is the original drainage plan for Oak Haven. It shows a pre-existing subsurface drainage system that the association is legally obligated to maintain. A murmur went through the crowd. Henderson's smile tightened just a fraction. He glanced at the map, then back at me, his eyes cold. An interesting historical document, he said calmly, but irrelevant. We have no record of such a system being operational. Then let me show you this, I said, placing my soil report next to the map. This is an analysis of the soil in my yard. It shows a massive unnatural deposit of silt. The system isn't just not operational, Mr. Henderson. It's blocked. It's backing up. And it's been dumping sediment onto my property. You're not proposing a new solution. You're trying to charge us $10,000 a head to fix a problem you were supposed to be preventing all along. The room was silent now. You could feel the tide of opinion shifting. People were leaning forward, looking from the map to Henderson's face. I had him. The logic was undeniable. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment of pure, triumphant clarity where you know you have the truth on your side and you're about to bring the house down. It's a heady feeling. But here's the thing about houses of cards. Sometimes they fall on you. Henderson let the silence hang for a moment. Then he chuckled. It was a soft, dismissive sound. I admire your passion, he said, looking at me like I was a child with a wild theory. You've clearly done a lot of homework. He then gestured to a man sitting quietly at the end of the table, a man I hadn't noticed before. He was dressed in a nondescript county official's uniform. This is Mr. Clark, Henderson announced. He's a senior inspector from the county's Water and Soil Department. We asked him to conduct an independent review, given the potential scope of the issue. Mr. Clark stood up. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. He cleared his throat and began to read from a report in a monotone voice. Based on our on-site inspection and review of county records, we find no evidence of a functional, registered drainage system in the area described. The soil saturation appears to be a localized issue, likely caused by improper landscaping and grade alteration on the specific property in question. He sat down. The air was sucked out of the room. It was my word against a county official, my found map against his official records. Henderson's trap had snapped shut. He had anticipated my move and brought in a so-called independent authority to publicly discredit me. I was no longer a concerned homeowner with evidence. I was a crackpot, a problem resident. Henderson turned back to the crowd, his face a mask of solemn responsibility. As you can see, we are handling this by the book. The board has voted to approve the remediation project with groundwater pros. A special assessment notice for $7,000 will be mailed to every homeowner in the affected zone next week. $7,000, not just for me, for everyone. He had expanded the scope, turning my personal problem into a community-wide tax. And in doing so, he made me the villain who had tried to stand in the way of progress and safety. The murmurs in the room were different now, hostile. People were looking at me, shaking their heads. In the space of 5 minutes, I had gone from hero to zero. I stood there, speechless, the heat rising in my face. My evidence, my logic, my truth, it all meant nothing. Henderson had outplayed me completely. He leaned towards me, his voice a low whisper only I could hear. "You should have just paid the 10,000, old man. It would have been cheaper." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. It was the smile of a predator that had just cornered its prey. That night, humiliation was a bitter taste in my mouth. I replayed the meeting over and over in my head, the smug look on Henderson's face, the averted eyes of the county inspector, Clark, the whispers from my neighbors. I had walked in there with the truth, and they had turned it into a weapon against me. The special assessment notice wasn't just a bill, it was a public shaming, a $7,000 price tag on my failure. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my dark living room, staring out at the yard. The moon cast a sickly pale light on the patches of mud. It looked like a battlefield after the fight was over, and I had lost. I felt that old, familiar despair creeping in, the ghost of my failed business whispering in my ear. "See? You can't win. The system is rigged. Just give up." What would you do in that situation, when you've laid all your cards on the table and the other guy just reveals he has a fifth ace up his sleeve? It's a moment that tests you down to your bones. Do you fold, or do you find a way to change the game? A few days later, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. My name was handwritten on the front in blocky, slightly shaky letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of a technical drawing. It wasn't a map, it was a schematic, a detailed diagram showing the specific connections and flow regulators of a drainage system. A series of numbers and arrows pointed to a specific access point, labeled Main Northern Feeder, Junction 7B. There was a handwritten note at the bottom. "He made me do it. He knows my boss. Sorry." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. Clark, the county inspector, the man who had publicly neutered me at the meeting. He was compromised, but his conscience had gotten the better of him. This schematic was his confession and his apology. It was the missing piece. My old map showed the general location of the system. This schematic showed me exactly where to find its heart. And it confirmed my suspicion. The system was real, and its choke point was somewhere nearby. A new energy surged through me. This wasn't just about being right anymore. It was about exposing a liar. Henderson hadn't just beaten me with bureaucracy. He had corrupted a public official to do it. The stakes had just been raised. But how could I use this? I couldn't just present the anonymous schematic. Henderson would deny it, call it a forgery. Clark would be forced to deny sending it to save his job. It would be my word against theirs all over again. I needed something more. I needed proof that was undeniable, physical, and public. I needed something they couldn't spin or dismiss. I needed a live demonstration. My geologist brain started working, piecing things together. The silt deposit in my yard, the blocked drainage system, the secret schematic from a guilty inspector, Henderson's overconfidence. The pieces were all there, but they formed a picture I didn't like. He wasn't just letting the system fail. The specific nature of the blockage, the way it was localized to flood my yard first. It felt deliberate. It felt like sabotage. I spent the next day walking the perimeter of the neighborhood, following the path of the drainage system from the old map, now cross-referenced with the new schematic. Junction 7B, according to the diagram, should be located near a small, overgrown patch of community land behind Henderson's own house, a place no one ever went. I found it half buried under a pile of rotting leaves and lawn clippings, a heavy cast-iron manhole cover, so old it had nearly fused with the earth around it. It took me a solid hour with a shovel and a crowbar to get it open. The air that rose from the hole was thick and foul, the smell of stagnant water and decay. I shone a powerful flashlight down into the darkness. It was a concrete junction box about 10 feet deep, and I saw it immediately. The main outflow pipe, the one that should have been carrying water away from our properties, was almost completely blocked. It was choked with a mass of hardened silt, rocks, and what looked like a deliberately stuffed bundle of old construction debris. But that wasn't the shocking part. There was another pipe leading out of the junction box, one that wasn't on any of the maps. A newer-looking PVC pipe. It had been crudely tapped into the side of the concrete box. I followed its direction with my eyes. It pointed directly toward Henderson's property. The full picture hit me like a physical blow. This was beyond corruption. This was a calculated, malevolent act. Henderson hadn't just neglected the drain. He had intentionally blocked it, causing the water to back up and flood his neighbors. And that new pipe? He had turned the community's drainage problem into his own private irrigation system, channeling the backed-up groundwater to keep his award-winning lawn perfectly green during the dry spells. He was literally flooding me to water his petunias. I sat back on the damp ground, the foul air filling my lungs. This was the moment everything changed, the moment the fight became something much, much darker. I had him. But now the question was no longer just how to prove it. It was how to make him pay for it in a way he would never, ever forget. The anger I felt was cold and sharp, like a shard of glass in my gut. It was a geologist's anger, slow, patient, and immensely destructive when finally unleashed. For days, I did nothing. I paid my regular bills. I waved at my neighbors. I let Henderson think he had won. Let him bask in his victory and the $7,000 checks that were starting to roll in from the nervous residents. An overconfident enemy is a careless enemy. My plan began to form, not as a single brilliant idea, but as a series of connected pieces, like fitting together the fragments of a shattered rock. I needed a stage, a public event where the whole community would be present, with no escape. And I knew just the one, the annual Oak Haven Neighbors' Day picnic, scheduled for the following Saturday. It was Henderson's favorite event, a day for him to play the benevolent lord of the manor, shaking hands and kissing babies. It was the perfect stage for his public execution. Next, I needed my tools, not lawyers or documents, but the tools of my trade. I went to a specialty chemical supply store and bought a 5-gallon drum of industrial-grade, water-soluble, fluorescent tracing dye, the kind used to track water flow in cave systems or detect leaks in sewer lines. It was bright, obnoxious, and utterly harmless to the environment. It was perfect. I also made a quiet visit back to Mr. Abernathy at the library. I didn't tell him my plan. I just asked if there were any other obscure community bylaws he could remember. He thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up behind his thick glasses. "There is one," he said. "The Common Use and Access Covenant, part of the original charter. It states that any utility or feature that impacts more than one property, even if it's on private land, is subject to inspection by any affected homeowner with 24 hours notice." He smiled. "They tried to get rid of it in the 90s, said it was intrusive, but the motion failed. It's still on the books." It was the final piece of the puzzle, the legal key that would let me walk right up to Henderson's door and turn his own world upside down. The day before the picnic, I posted a formal public notice on the community forum. Pursuant to the Oak Haven Common Use and Access Covenant, Section 4, a public inspection of the subsurface drainage system will be conducted tomorrow at 2 p.m., starting at Junction 7B, to investigate ongoing drainage failures impacting multiple properties. I cited the bylaw and listed the affected property numbers, mine and a dozen of my neighbors. Henderson must have seen it within minutes. I could imagine his momentary panic, followed by his trademark arrogance. He probably thought I was bluffing, making one last desperate stand. He even replied to the post, "While this is highly irregular, the board respects all community bylaws, no matter how archaic. We will, of course, be present to ensure this inspection is conducted properly and safely." He was trying to co-opt my event, to control the narrative. He had no idea what was coming. Saturday arrived, a bright sunny day, perfect for a picnic. The whole community was out. The smell of barbecue smoke filled the air. Kids were running around. Music was playing. Henderson was in his element, holding court by the main pavilion. At 1:55 p.m., I walked to the center of the lawn, a portable microphone in my hand that I'd borrowed from a friend who DJs weddings. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice booming across the park. The music stopped. All eyes turned to me. "As per the public notice, the community drainage inspection is about to begin. I invite you all to witness it." I had a small wagon with me. In it was the drum of fluorescent green dye and a long hose. A small crowd started to follow me, drawn by the promise of drama. Henderson and the other board members hurried to catch up, their faces a mixture of annoyance and concern. We arrived at the open manhole behind Henderson's property. I looked at the crowd, then directly at Henderson. "The theory is simple," I said loudly. If the community drain is simply blocked, as has been suggested, then any water introduced here should simply back up. But if it has been illegally tampered with, well, let's find out. I attached the hose to the drum, fed it down into the junction box, and opened the spigot. A thick, viscous stream of neon green liquid gurgled down into the darkness. The crowd was silent, watching intently. The local kid who ran a drone photography business had his machine hovering overhead, its camera whirring. "What is the meaning of this?" Henderson sputtered, his face starting to lose its confident sheen. "This is vandalism." "It's a diagnostic test, Mr. Henderson," I replied calmly. "Perfectly harmless, unless, of course, you have something to hide." We waited. For a full minute, nothing happened. The crowd started to fidget. I could hear someone whisper, "This is crazy." I felt a flicker of doubt. Had I miscalculated? And then it began. A woman on the far side of the crowd gasped and pointed. Everyone turned to look. From the base of Henderson's prize marble birdbath, a trickle of fluorescent green water was emerging. Then another trickle from the sprinkler heads embedded in his impossibly lush lawn. Within seconds, his entire backyard was erupting with streams of lurid glowing green. It was like a scene from a science fiction movie. His secret irrigation system, fed by the water he was stealing from his neighbors, was now broadcasting his crime in neon. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then someone started to laugh. It was a low, bitter laugh, but it broke the spell. Everyone was looking at Henderson, whose face had gone from tan to a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I turned back to the crowd, the microphone still in my hand. "The special assessment," I said, my voice ringing with cold fury, "is hereby canceled." The aftermath was a beautiful, chaotic mess. Henderson didn't just look defeated, he looked broken. His authority, built on a foundation of lies and manicured lawns, had been washed away by a tide of fluorescent green. The drone footage from the local kid went viral in our little community within the hour. There was no spinning this. The visual was just too powerful, too damning. His perfectly green lawn, bleeding neon guilt. The board convened an emergency meeting that very evening, not in the clubhouse, but right there in the park, surrounded by angry homeowners. Henderson didn't even show up. He was a ghost. His resignation, along with the rest of the boards, was announced before the sun went down. The $7,000 special assessment was, of course, dead on arrival. The money that had already been collected was ordered to be refunded. Now, here's the part where you might expect a lawsuit, maybe even criminal charges. Have you ever been in a situation where you have someone dead to rights, and all you want is to see them punished to the fullest extent of the law? That's what most people in the crowd wanted. They wanted blood. But as I stood there, watching the chaos unfold, I felt something else. I looked at the faces of my neighbors. They weren't just angry. They were tired. Tired of the fighting, the suspicion, the extra cost. A long, drawn-out legal battle would just poison the well even further. It would cost everyone more time, more money, and more peace of mind. A small group of residents approached me. They wanted me to take over, to become the new president of the association. It was a tempting offer, the power to fix things, to make sure this never happened again. But I looked at their faces and saw the same trap that Henderson had fallen into, just from a different angle. I didn't want to be the king of this little hill. I just wanted my yard back. So I made a choice. I stood up and proposed something different. I told them I wouldn't be president. Instead, I nominated a new interim board made up of a few quiet, sensible people I'd come to know. A retired accountant, a young mother who was a civil engineer, and old Mr. Abernathy from the library for his historical knowledge. Then I made my offer to the community right there in front of everyone. "Here's the deal," I said. "We can spend the next 2 years dragging Henderson through the courts, or we can have him sign a legally binding agreement tonight. He will pay, out of his own pocket, for the complete excavation and restoration of the original drainage system for the entire community. He will also pay for the restoration of any property damaged by his activities. In exchange, the community agrees not to pursue criminal charges." It was a pragmatic victory, not a righteous one. It was about fixing the problem, not just punishing the man. After a heated debate, they agreed. Henderson backed into a corner with no leverage left, signed the agreement that night. He was financially ruined, but he stayed out of jail. A week later, a for sale sign went up on his lawn. The house sold in a day. The work on the drainage system began a month later. They dug up the old choked pipes and replaced them. My yard was a mess of trenches and machinery for a while, but it was the beautiful mess of healing, not the ugly mess of decay. I never got my personal apology from Henderson. I never got the satisfaction of seeing him in a courtroom. That's the price of the path I chose. The victory felt quiet. It was the satisfaction of a problem solved, a system restored. It was a geologist's victory. A few months later, after the new sod had taken root in my yard, the new community board did something. One evening, I came home to find a crew installing new permanent solar-powered lights along the public walkways of the neighborhood. The design was simple, elegant. They were an exact match for the ones Henderson's goons had destroyed all those months ago. I stood on my porch, watching them flicker on as dusk settled, casting a warm, gentle glow. I looked down at my old soil sampler, which now sits on my mantelpiece. It's not a trophy, it's a reminder that sometimes, to find the truth, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty, and that the ground beneath your feet always, eventually, tells the story. And if you've been through anything like this, you know what I mean. Stick around for more stories. And if you feel so inclined, a subscription to Karenology is always appreciated. You never know when you'll need it.